Have you seen me dice bag? The Grognard Files.
Borag Thung. My name is Dirk the Dice, and this is the Grognard Files podcast, talking bobbins about tabletop RPGs from back in the day and today. This is the second part of the episode 18, which is all about Judge Dredd RPG from Games Workshop and our memories of 2000 AD. This is an extra bit with all the stuff that didn't fit in the first part. It's not a follow-up, it's a companion. We love hearing from listeners, and the first part has encouraged discussion on the grognardfiles.com site. Thanks to Orlanth for this review on iTunes. Life-changing. Well, not really. A great trip down Senility Street, yet with its jaundiced eye firmly fixed on the horizon. All of the games are reviewed with humour and warmth. Whilst playing the podcast, where my wife could hear, she burst out, "I can't believe they spent so much time thinking so deeply about this." She's got a point. In this podcast, we go deep diving into the rules for Judge Dredd RPG with our resident rules lawyer, Judge BLYTHY. Marc Gascoigne returns to face the Games Master screen and talk about his career beyond Judge Dredd RPG. But first, it's Daily Dwarf. He talks about his history with 2000 AD, the galaxy's greatest comic. Let's be careful out there. Ramblers, let's get rambling.
White Dwarf.
2000 AD and me. Britain in early 1977, a country languishing in the doldrums, moribund, with discontent stalking the land. In this gloomy atmosphere, what could the kids turn to for entertainment? We only had 3 TV channels to choose from, or if we were desperate, we could always listen to our older brothers' prog rock albums. Lord help us. Hard times indeed, but luckily rebellion was staring. A movement intent on kicking out the old guard, of overthrowing the establishment. What's that you say? Punk rock? Oh no, this was something much more subversive. The galaxy's greatest comic, 2000 AD. I missed Prog 1, but I became aware of the space spinners flying across the playground, so sent my mother out on a doomed journey around the newsagents of Cardiff to see if they had any copies left. Too late, I'm afraid. So Prog 2 was my first issue, and what a free gift it had on the cover. Biotronic stickers. These led to a whole nation of mini Steve Austins running rampage across the concrete schoolyards of Britain, making the slow motion sound effect from the $6 Million Man as they went. Great stuff, even if peeling them off your arm was a minor exercise in torture. Prog 2 was of course famously the first issue to feature the lawman of the future, Judge Dredd. So what were my first impressions of old Stonyface all those years ago? Well, I don't remember Dredd from those early issues at all. Complete blank. Sorry, Joe. Other strips did create a lasting impression. I remember enjoying the fast-paced, jet-packing, kung-fu-kicking action of Harlem Heroes and cheered on the plucky British underground resistance in Invasion. Sadly, not having Prog 1, I did miss the sight of Prime Minister Shirley Brown, being gunned down on the steps of St Paul's by those nasty Vogues. But more than any other, the strip that burned itself into my young brain was Flesh. How could this strip not appeal to the 7-year-old boy? The setup was so high concept. It was positively stratospheric. What happened to the dinosaurs? Well, cowboys from the future were harvesting them for meat, that's what. Genius. The machinations of the grizzled Earl Regan and Claw Carver and their conflict with the formidable Tyrannosaur Old One-Eye were compelling. The hag monster wants blood. Not only that, 2000 AD also gave us Flesh, the card game. I don't remember the details of the game anymore, but I do have a distinct memory of my excited anticipation dutifully gluing the pages to some old cereal boxes and cutting at the cards. Flesh and Invasion were my first exposure to the work of Pat Mills, the original Tharg the Mighty. I instantly became a fan of his work and have remained so over the years. His combination of wildly inventive imagination, an acerbic sense of humour, and an anti-authoritarian streak has made for many memorable stories. If Peter Cook and Bob Black had decided to collaborate on a Michael Moorcock tale, you get Pat Mills. Now, he might not thank me for comparing him with Moorcock, given his annoyance with Michael Moorcock's critical comments around the time of 2000 AD's launch. But nevertheless, I think the comparison is apposite. Both writers enjoy playing with the conventions and subversing genre tropes, and they both have a history of linking their disparate stories into a wider arcing narratives. Pat Mills' writing combines some savage satire with an authentic British eccentricity, and I think he's enjoyed his role corrupting the minds of Britain's youth, in the best possible way, you understand, for over 40 years. He's always held true to his principles, continually challenging the elites and those in power, always standing up for the outsider, the little guy, even if that little guy happens to be a gargantuan T-Rex. For my 7-year-old self, though, a problem was looming. As well as 2000 AD, back in 1977, I was also a keen reader of Crazy Comic, which had been launched in the previous year. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, my mother issued an ultimatum. I could only have one comic each week. What an impossible choice. As much as I was enjoying 2000 AD at the time, I also loved the exploits of the characters in Crazy. Birdman and Chicken, Scaredy Cat, Hit Kid and all. And so, Tharg forgive me, the decision was made. I opted for Crazy. Who knows how a short history might have ended at this point if it wasn't for another publication several years later. What else but White Dwarf? Everything comes back to White Dwarf. After a sequence of striking fantasy science fiction artwork, sometimes wonderful, sometimes weird, the cover for White Dwarf 36 was a bit different. A comic book art featuring some kind of cop dressed as a cross between a stormtrooper and a member of the village people, menacing a punk. Inside that glorious Brian Bolland cover, Ian Livingstone explained the background to his Judge Dredd board game. The game sounded fun, and it was based on a character from the comic 2000 AD. Eh? 2000 AD? Oh yes, I remember reading that back when I was 7. It might still have ended there, but for two things. One, the issue of White Dwarf also contained a full-paged advert for the Titan Books reprint series of the classic Judge Dredd stories, and two, soon after, my friendly local game shop, the much-missed FC Parker, started stocking those books on their shelves. With their lovely, glossy, full-colour covers, those Titan reprints were impossible to resist. And Titan certainly knew what they were doing. They hit us punters with the 1-2 of a Bolland collection, followed by one of the strips from Mike Mahowan. I feel now that I owe all of these creators an apology, as I've read both Pat Mills and Dredd writer John Wagner complain that they received a very poor deal from those Titan reprints. But they were a great way to catch up on all those classic Dredd stories I missed in the 2000 AD-less years. I was hooked. The versatility of Megacity 1 as a backdrop has allowed writers to tackle all kinds of stories, from the horror of the Dark Judges to the action and adrenaline rush of the Apocalypse War, to stories of out-and-out craziness like The Stupid Gun and Otto Sump's Ugly Clinic. At the centre of it all, of course, is Judge Dredd himself, Sometimes a hero, trekking through the cursed earth to save Megacity 2, but often the villain, his repeated brutal suppression of democracy. I suspect the satire and politics were sometimes lost on my teenage self, but one of the things I find intriguing about reading Dredd now is that you find yourself rooting for the murderous, repressive fascist. I could start reminiscing about all the classic Dredd stories from the past and the amazing artists who brought them to life, but you'll likely know them all anyway, so I'll stick to a quick mention of one. It's not the greatest Judge Dredd story, but it's one of my favourites, and it contains many elements that go to make a quintessential Dredd tale. Requiem for a Heavyweight ran from Prog's 331 to 334 and is a deft mix of police procedural, authentic megacity madness, in this case illegal eating competitions, and some great comic writing from John Wagner and Alan Grant, and very effective artwork from Carlos Equezra. As is often the case, Dredd is fairly implacable at the centre of things, immune to the insanity around him, his focus solely on upholding the law. It also features a tragic hero, a character archetype that often occurs in Judge Dredd stories. Think of Uncle Ump and Otto Sump. In this case, our hero is Abominable Arnie Stodgeman, a man who just loves to eat, trained to take part in the heavyweight eating championship of the world. He seems to knowingly pursue a doomed course, powerless to avoid the tragic end that awaits him. It's as if Arnie knows his path is set to destruction, but he can't help it but follow it. I said, "Give me the pie!" I started buying 2000 AD regularly again in the late 1980s, which happened to coincide with several great stories. The Black Hole, Pat Mills and Simon Bisley enlist the ABC Warriors to save the Earth from destruction. Slain, the Horn God, from the same creative team, a landmark storyline that really announced Bisley into the world. Zenith, Grant Morrison and Steve Yoel's innovative and refreshingly cynical take on superheroes. This very British approach to the genre was continued more recently with Rob Williams' The 10 Seconders. Since that time, I've had an on-off relationship with buying 2000 AD. Currently, it's very much on again. I'd say it's currently going through a bit of a golden period, as well as many classic series being revived, and Dredd on great form as ever. There are many new series well worth your attention. Jaeger, a rogue trooper, retold from the point of view of the bad guys. Aquila, ultra-violence in a supernatural ancient Rome. And Hope, film noir collides with the occult, just to name a few. There have been so many memorable stories over the last 40 years of 2000 AD, but I thought I'd close with my absolute favourite, Nemesis the Warlock. I can't imagine anything as vibrant, as deranged, as out there as this series coming from American comics. The story of the struggles between Nemesis, the demonic alien, and Torquemada, the leader of a future Earth, and the descendant of the head of the Spanish Inquisition, gave Pat Mills an opportunity to once again champion the outsider, with the alien Nemesis cast as the good guy, as well as to publicly exercise the trauma of his Catholic upbringing. Rereading the tales recently, I was struck by both the wild invention of the storylines and also the level of humour Pat Mills injects. The earlier books in particular featuring the oddball antics of some of Nemesis's extended family. Kevin O'Neill will forever be the artist most associated with Nemesis the Warlock, and that's difficult to argue with. The insane level of detail in the art of these early stories is breathtaking. But the other artists who later took on the strip also brought their own distinctive styles to bear. Brian Talbot had the unenviable task of taking over from Kevin O'Neill partway through the epic The Gothic Empire. O'Neill had already established a very distinctive look for this story, with, according to Pat Mills, without any doubt the greatest comic book steampunk art of all time. I can't disagree with that, but fortunately, an artist of the calibre of Brian Talbot was more than capable of evolving the visuals, adopting a dark, Dickensian sensibility and giving us an earthier, more organic Nemesis, in contrast to Kevin O'Neill's angular, burnished chrome alien. The story itself has it all: war, intrigue, cross and double cross, not to mention the return of the ABC warriors. Brian Talbot illustrated a number of subsequent Nemesis stories before the late, great John Hinkleton took over. His style suited the later Nemesis tales perfectly, no more so than in Deathbringer. This story sees both Nemesis and Torquemada washed up from the time waste in a bleak, depressing modern-day Britain. Hicklenton's art expertly captures the dispiriting, grimy mood, with Nemesis and Torquemada now seemingly resigned to the knowledge that they'll remain locked in a perpetual conflict. Even here, though, there's still room for some of Mills's humour, as Hicklenton's powerful, sinuous demon, armed with sword sinister, battles with a bulging, eye-popping Torquemada, armed with a hedge trimmer. It's a memorable story, wonderfully rendered in some outstanding artwork. And that's the point with this, and so many 2000 AD tales. The fusion of story and artwork makes each element elevate the other. These stories work best as comics. Long may 2000 AD continue.
Games Master Screen.
Welcome to the Games Master Screen and the return of Marc Gascoigne, the lead writer and line developer for the Judge Dredd RPG for Games Workshop back in the 1980s. Hello, Marc.
Hiya.
So, I'll just put this screen in front of us and a table filled with interesting high points of Marc's career in gaming and publishing. This time, because it is Marc, I'm armed with 2 dice and a pencil, so I can pick, apparently at random, a topic for discussion. So without further ado, it's 9. Titan, the fighting fantasy world.
I'd done the fighting fantasy monster book Out of the Pit first while I was still at Workshop in London just before we moved up. And that was another one of those gigs that Steve and Ian were approached to do. And they very kindly came in and said, hey, do you fancy doing a monster book, which I did. And that sold very well. And then I got charged with doing Titan, the fighting fantasy world book, which is among the best things I've ever worked on in a fairly lengthy career, because I just put heart and soul into it, much the same as happened with the Dredd game. But in this case, I was making up 9/10 of it. It wasn't finding an obscure reference to a particular type of new cult or whatever, or a faded TV star for the Dredd game, so we could write him into the glossary. It was coming up with plans for an elf treetop village, or a whole religious system, or a map of the demon kings of hell and their various halls in the pit, and so on and so forth. And that came out and again did very well. Both of those books were top 10 children's bestsellers.
Well, it's really really well written, and I've got a copy here actually. It still stands up today. And one of the things that it stands out for is the fabulous cover, of course, with the
Christos Achilleos, wonderful cover designer.
Yeah.
He was one of those guys. It was actually a dream to work with. As a teenager, I'd bought SF and fantasy novels with his cover art on. A whole bunch of Paul Anderson, Nicholas Van Ryn novels that I didn't particularly care for, but because they had Chris Achilleos covers, they're all right by me. And to be able to brief him on that cover and give him the details of what we wanted on it, and then have him deliver such a magnificent piece of art that's been reused here, there, and everywhere, including in Warhammer roleplay stuff in the end. But what a wonderful artist. And ultimately, when I moved on from Workshop, as the roleplay stuff was starting to fade, but also because, frankly, I was a mouthy git who still thought he was a fanzine editor. And I wasn't playing very well with others. And as I say, I was one of the team who were doing things other than Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, so there were all sorts of things going in. So I got given the push, and as luck would have it, the fighting fantasy consultant editor was moving on. So they asked me, because I knew a lot about the world, whether I knew anything about taking apart the actual game books and making them work. And of course I said I did, and that was it, and off I went. So although I ran that line for Puffin as a consultant editor for close on a decade, and we ended up however many tens of millions of books sold, 59 titles in the whole range, plus a bunch of spin-offs, co-wrote some of the novels and background books, but also the Advanced Fighting Fantasy role-play system, which along with Wolfrup and Dredd, I still think might be the top 3 best-selling British RPG systems, because that one went out through bookstores and sold in its 10s, 20s, 30,000 copies over and over again, and then was licensed into all these languages on the back of Fighting Fantasy being absolutely in its prime and pomp. And that one was the exact opposite to Dredd, in that it was purely beginner-aimed. The first adventure you play in the first book, Dungeoneer, you don't actually even use any rules for. We just take you through a role-play call and response, and it's only in the second adventure we start adding rules to it and die roll. And it's all D6 based, but it uses a fairly complicated skill modifier system derived from adding a bit of bells and whistles to Fighting Fantasy. But Fighting Fantasy is just a D6 system. And that was tremendous fun. But yet again, a bit like the Dredd role-playing game, I'm the background and world and imaginative arty guy, and I ended up doing the rule system, while my co-writer Pete Tamlin did who's very much a rules developer, did all the writing and the fluffy stuff and the adventures. I have no idea what was going on with that, but it was damn good fun, and we did 3 of those. A couple more planned that didn't happen, but absolutely tremendous stuff.
Next up, it's almost a fumble. A story I'm fascinated by, and that's The Fate of Dark Future.
A cyberpunk game, and it was a cyberpunk RPG, and it was not the car racing game as it ended up initially. It was from a couple of people who'd read Neuromancer and Count Zero, but nothing else, because nothing else was on the market at that point. And we were putting our plans together as the first wave of cyberpunk novels. Bruce Sterling and Bruce Becky and Walter John Williams, Hardwired particularly had a big influence because that's very much adventure based, was starting to get published. And it was another Tamlin Gascoigne proposed production with a very sleek game system. Got to be the background editor on that. It was one of my freelance jobs after I moved on from Workshop, because I kept working for them for a couple of years, finishing off the Dredd Companion and that and a bunch of Blood Bowl stuff. And the stuff what we were weaving back in was all the meaty stuff that had to make the background work. But then good old Kim Newman particularly, but the various novel writers from the first wave of Games Workshop fiction took all that and went bananas with it in terms of alternate history. But Kim particularly in things like Demon Download, where Elvis Presley is a sanctioned operative out chasing down perps across the Badlands. And all that sort of stuff was really interesting. We did look at licensing off a more recent version back into an RPG, but this time playing full feasance to the Warhammer background that was hidden beneath the fiction. Because it was always planned, the moment we were bolting on the background, that there would also be hints of chaos mutation. And then I worked out this very arcane system where the 4 chaos gods entered Earth at different times. And one of them, Slanesh, entered in the body of Elvis's stillborn dead twin, Jesse Garin Presley, and entered the world at that point. But the others entered at different points that were key branch points in the alternate history. And the forces were now gathering to turn the post-apocalypse Mad Maxi type Earth into a chaos wasteland. Thankfully, probably for everyone's sanity, that never happened. But
so how far in development did it get, Mark? The
role-play game we never played.
Right.
But there was a basic rules system. There were adventures written, and we got very close. And then, to the extent that because we were kind of mavens of the old fanzine system and what they used to call the hobby Illuminati back in the day, there were several issues of fanzines devoted to speculating what Dark Future might be if only the guys would ever write it. And at that point, we started to get, Pete and I, somewhat disenchanted with that. It's like, well, perhaps this is a hoax game and we don't need to make it. But then, as I say, at that point, the Battle Cars game turned into Dark Future and off it went into its own glorious thing. And why not?
Okay, roll again, and it's a 10. your only fighting fantasy book, Battle Blade Warrior.
Indeed, yes, unbelievably. Although I say I worked on the line for a decade, I only wrote one game book. Though one of the reasons for that was I had a whole bunch of ideas, but I didn't want to be the editor who also commissions himself to do work. I don't think that's particularly ethical. So I had another one, The Night of the Creature, that was going to be about number 40, and then hopped on and hopped on and hopped on, and eventually it's going to be number 61, and we shut at 59. So that didn't happen, and it was only ever in note form. But I did do the worked with Stephen Inn on novels and background books and things. So.
What's the process then for creating a solo game? Is it just lots of post-it notes and lines drawn?
My day job for them, or at least the consultant editor, part of my freelance life with them, was actually getting enormous sheets of paper all over the floor of my flat, where you would start drawing an entire flowchart, much like a chemical reaction or chemical process, and numbering them to make sure that all the numbers match up and go to the right place. But actually writing it is not dissimilar. For me, and Battle Blade Warrior is explicitly this. Battle Blade Warrior picks up from a paragraph I explicitly wrote in Titan about a besieged city, and I knew a year and a half before I even proposed the game book that would make a great adventure seed. There were a whole bunch of those in Titan, quite deliberately. But that one I did, in the end, hive off for myself. So it had a plot, which is break out, find the ultimate terror weapon if you can, and then come back with it to release the siege, with all sorts of stuff going on in the middle that I wanted to feed in. But more than anything, you kind of have an end point, a few middle points, and then you have to set off. And you have to juggle between taking a particular path, which may be the path you want them to tell, but then remembering, actually, just like a GM, you have to give people options. So at the end of every corridor, you turn left or right, or at a crossroads, you can go to the mountains or the hills, or at a particular point, you decide to keep going this way or that way. For me, there's then the extra level of very clever gameplay, which is often hidden until you realize what people are doing. But as people wrote their third and their fifth game book in the range, they started to realize that there were other things they could do. So, for example, you get a thing like, you have found the golden key. If someone says, have you got a golden key? Follow that option. Well, that's all very well, but that tells people you should have the golden key. But if it says, if you have the golden key, anytime someone scratches their nose, add 20 to the paragraph you're on and go there instead, then you've got hidden mechanics. And you may have almost a bit like secret levels in Doom or whatever. You've got things that you'll only know if you really have been that way. And suddenly that got really interesting, because you could build all sorts of levels of things into it, taking things into a whole secret hidden level that you'd only know if you got that. Though, to be honest, nothing would ever match up to Creature of Havoc. I don't know if you know that one.
Yeah,
That's Steve Jackson's book, where you wake up and you're in the body of a monster. And it's written in a garbled, coded language. So every time someone speaks to you, it's in BCFGQRP rather than hello monster, what are you doing? And you can try and crack the code, but more likely you play halfway and then learn some of the keys to decode some of the things being said to you. But it was that playfulness has always attracted me, the ability to take something and try and break it, even within the constraints of it. There are things you can do in game books like that just make me so happy. And it was wonderful working with very talented people who were doing these sort of things and developing them, encouraging them, picking different parts of the world, because after Titan there were areas set aside for adventures to be set in, and then trying to do different things, doing the 2-player ones where you each had a game book and you would meet somewhere in the middle and fight with each other and then head off and kind of stalk each other, and all sorts of different ideas with it. Ultimately, of course, computers had already superseded us pretty much by the time the first game books came out. But for a glorious 10, 12 years in the sun, it was tremendous, and was the next stage in the evolution of those sort of adventures. But the moment you could put on fast-moving graphics and things that would take you here, there, and everywhere, even in the early days of Spectrum games, your Manic Miners or whatever, then it became a blind alley, perhaps.
Okay. And that's 7. So further adventures in publishing, and that's developing the Warhammer fiction line.
Yeah, I had been doing Finding Fantasy for about 10, 11 years, and that was coming to an end. And I actually got asked if I'd give a guy called Andy Jones, the Games Workshop studio, a bit of freelance help, a bit of editing, a bit of design work on some Warhammer Quest material. Now, Warhammer Quest was kind of like the board game equivalent of Warhammer Roleplay, where you would go down down dungeons, you'd have various geomorphs and various characters, and it was all a very jolly beer and pretzels approach to it. And every so often they do another character or another adventure pack, and I started doing those simply because the studio was at capacity making a lot of Warhammer stuff. And I got talking to him, and Rick Priestley had an idea to do a Warhammer equivalent to the old Blue Peter annuals, based obviously on the classic BBC show, but more importantly, it's spin-off Christmas books, which were a mix of John Noakes shows you how to make the Christmas crown out of 4 coat hangers and a bit of non-flammable tinsel, to here's Pete and Val going up the Orinoco on a raft, and here's a cartoon strip, Bleep and Booster. It used to be amazing kids sci-fi strip, and here's some stories, and so doing that for Warhammer would make something very special that was a conglomerate of the best of White Dwarf, plus a whole bunch of special features, but including stories and comic strips, which there really wasn't room in the pages of White Dwarf, very much devoted, obviously, to modelling, painting and gaming with all the new releases. So we pottered away on that as an idea, and they offered me a job to come in and help make it work, and that became Inferno magazine, which was quite compromised into being a magazine rather than a book. But out of that, we commissioned our first fiction. In the first or second issue, there was a story about Gaunt's Ghosts by a guy called Dan Abnett, who'd come in to do comic strips because he was a 2000 AD guy who we'd got talking to, who was an old RPG gamer. And incredibly talented fellow, realised that he was very good at capturing the Warhammer spirit in comic scripts and in fiction. And very soon that turned into Warhammer Monthly Comic, first big teenage comic launch in Britain since 2000 AD. It was ridiculous. We went off and won all the awards that 2000 AD wasn't eligible for, just on this funny little black and white comic. But that then led to graphic novels, and more importantly to the novels. And the Black Library, run by Andy, with myself as the assistant editor, grew into a team of 5 and then 12, and then we were doing novels monthly and then novels 2 a month, and then we were selling them and selling some more, and people were starting to feed back into the games, and it just grew and grew and grew. And it was an obvious thing, but there was some very key strategies behind it. But more than anything, it was treating the IP with respect. There's a lot of tie-in fiction out there, and some of it is great. What they're doing with Star Wars at the moment, getting in amazing writers, I know all sorts. And Delilah Dawson's book is out on Ray this month, and just a splendid piece of work. But a whole bunch of people, whether it's Ken Liu or Chuck Wendig or various other people, writing the best new sci-fi writers writing Star Wars. But there's also a tradition of absolute shonky old crap, particularly on the gaming tie-in side. And some of it's perfectly good color text that will give you an example of how the game is. Some of it will really take on a life of its own, like Ed Greenwood's and Paul Kemp's work in Forgotten Realms and similar writers, Raymond Feiss and various other folks. But more than anything, the key with the Warhammer stuff was to make it as absolutely as good as we possibly could and make sense of the world, a lot of which had been created only for games on a tabletop, and there were a lot of gaps in it. There's no currency in the Warhammer world until you get into the roleplay. There's no measurement of time and distances and years until you get into the roleplay side. In 40k world, none of that is talked about. What's the currency in Warhammer 40,000 universe? Sooner or later, these questions had to be answered, but we had to work within those constraints. The other thing we had to do was, certainly in the early days, was create worlds that didn't impinge on the soldier's game, because you buy your armies, you want to play with them. What you don't want is to invest in a particular Imperial Guard regiment and then learn that Dan Abnett or whoever has killed them off in the latest novel. You don't want to have your army wiped out. That's often, that overall ethos is why sometimes the Warhammer worlds feel like they're in a bit of a stasis, because you can't say to someone who spent hundreds of quid and, as importantly, hundreds of hours painting up this glorious looking regiment to go field on the field of battle, you can't suddenly take their soldiers out of the game background. So we had to put everything back in the box. But on that first week, we talked about Horus Heresy, which was the 10,000 years earlier origin myth of a lot of the Chaos Warriors and Space Marines and the Immortal Emperor and so on, as a potential for line. And it only took me 9 years to get to the point where we were trusted enough to not break any of the background worlds, not to play merry hell with the existing IP, but also to create amazing fiction with very talented writers. They finally let us work off those first three, with Dan Abnett, Graham McNeil, and I think Ben Counter, the third one. And look where they are now. Every one of those hits the bestseller list, tens of thousands of copies sold month in, month out. And absolutely world-beating approach to high-quality fiction that's taken on a life of its own and has led finally to Horus Heresy going back into the games, which since they always told me they never would do that, I'm very pleased to say.
Excellent. Now, this next question, Mark, is a sponsored question because I wasn't playing games. I wasn't playing games in the 90s, and I missed a game called EarthDawn. And my friends at the Smart Party podcast, they keep telling me that I've missed a real treat. And I know that you worked on a box set, didn't you, with Carl Sargent? So how did that come about?
Well, Carl had been doing game books. Carl had also been doing various Warhammer Fantasy roleplay stuff and was a Nottingham-based writer at the time, and we got talking about all sorts of things. Because he was freelance, he was looking for other projects, and we actually started writing Shadowrun, which was the cyberpunk but with reborn elves and magic powers game that Fazza were just carving their own clever little niche with. And this is cyberpunk very much as it is late 80s, early 90s with the American style. Everyone looks like Billy Idol, even the women. And it's cool, but it's a little bit broad. We brought in a slightly more British perspective. We did the British background book and the Irish book Tin Enoch, which is a very magical book, and tie-in adventures, but then started doing novels for them. And the way Carl and I would work, Carl is always was a word machine. He hasn't written in the game industry for a fair while. But his background in both science writing and working on Warhammer and before that TSR stuff was he'd do you 10,000 words across a couple of days. So we between us would plot it out. He'd go away and bat it out, and I'd then rewrite it and edit it, which meant that for Fazza, we were supplying them basically with camera-ready copy. They'd give it a proofread and off it would go. And that's not always the case with freelance stuff. Often there are people who are enthusiastic game players but not necessarily perhaps able to provide stuff to that high quality. So we were being given a lot of things to do, some of which we were out of their depth. Me particularly, since I've never played Shadowrun or Earth. I'm fascinated to learn that there is a little coterie who still revere EarthDawn.
Yes, yeah.
I think every game has its little champions, and if it's, I think exotic particularly, because people rarely remember a game mechanic unless they're into the design. But a particular type of game world, or even just an amazing approach to design and art, layout will be remembered. One of my favourites is also always a game called Sky Realms of Jaroon.
Oh yes,
which is in its feel actually is not dissimilar to EarthDawn in that it's that slightly exotic hints of dinosaurs and lizards to it. But the artwork in that was so incredible for its time that I've never played the game, but I have every single one of the Jaroon books in my museum because they're just an absolute acme of beautiful product at that time.
Just before we move on to what you're doing nowadays, just talk about your museum. Do you still have all your gaming stuff? Future?
I have an awful lot of it. I think that I've sold a few pieces from time to time, but mostly things like the very first editions of the 40k role playing game and all the supplements, all the stuff I used to pick up as just office samples. But certainly the very earliest fanzines I bought, I've got all of those. That copy of Troll Crusher that inspired Dragon Lords, and the copy of Underworld Oracle 5 that I took to the printer and said I want something like this, and where everybody gave me a box of unstable sheets, bastard. And all those things. But my lad, who's 11, heading on 35, came to me and said, "Oh, that game they play on Big Bang Theory, Dungeons and Dragons, that's not real, is it?" Because he knows that some of them are made up. He knows Talisman that they play on, it's real, because Dad, in my last days at Workshop the second time, worked on the new edition. But I said, "No, D&D, my son. Come this way." And I opened up the cupboard in his sister's room here, and boxes and boxes of supplements and the soldiers and the floor plans and the Judges Guild and copies of Dragon magazine and all these things. So don't tell him, but he's getting a set for his birthday in January, and that's it. His gaming group will begin if he wants to keep it wants to play it, and off we go.
Oh, that's great news.
But as you know, yeah, when you get into games, when you get into kids rather, and the family life, gaming groups become harder and harder to organise. But actually, what we've seen across the last 10 years, of course, is the rise of board game nights. And with some of the workshop guys, I've been out playing board games again. But my big thing actually is card games. Those clever little games, whether it's Flux or Love Letter or whatever, something you can do in 20 minutes. Because frankly, you know that you've got one ear open for the noise that's going on up in someone's bedroom when they're meant to be asleep on a Friday night. And fitting those things in here and there and everywhere is really where it's at for the moment, at least till they grow up and leave. Which the way he's going is going to be very soon, bless him, 11 or not. But yes, a lot of these things, I keep saying to myself, well, should I stick them on eBay for people who really enjoy them? But actually, they all mean a lot to me, because the things I've held on to have been the things that we played and died in, or played and won, or had adventures, or the bits where, frankly, I went through them all and took that fantasy idea and used it in a Dredd adventure, or to inspire the seed of some Cthulhu game or whatever. It all feeds in, and it's all part of that background. It's what made me who I am, along with the Moorcock novels and the Hawkwind albums and years working on workshop fiction and comic books and all those things.
And just tell us a little bit about Angry Robot and how that came about. And we were running I was running Black Library, and that had been going 11 years, and I was getting bored. And we'd had a separate unit within the bigger, what they used to call BL Publishing, Black Library Publishing, a workshop, which is all the non-tabletop stuff. And we were doing role-playing games, and there was some licensed product, and we'd started an imprint, Solaris, which was original fiction, using some of the workshop money to get that going. And they needed to save money, and they saw this bored, bolshy bloke, and I moved on. But in my last days at workshop, I'd been talking to the people at HarperCollins, who were looking at how well Black Library was selling bucket loads of fiction to teenage and adult males, which is traditionally the area who don't read SF. And the means we were doing it, often by using forums. Black Library was the only bit of workshop allowed to run a forum. It was seen as too dangerous without moderation, but we'd trained civilian moderators who were all our champions, and were very calm and logical about what we did. So we were making great guns with that, and HarperCollins said, well, come in and have a chat, and if we gave you a bit of money, what would you do? And I pitched something which was pretty much identical to what we've been doing with Solaris and Black Library. And they said, well, go and make a business plan. And that was it. We're off. And I'd been talking to them. I'd been talking to Osprey, who would do the military non-fiction reference books. They were looking at a fiction line. And actually also talking to Blizzard, the Warcraft people, about building up a bigger fiction line for them. But in the end, HarperCollins won, being based in the UK and having quite a bit of cash. And so Angry Robot was born, and the name came out of nowhere one night. We were going to be called Darkstar, and I pitched this whole thing very much in the Solaris's shadow in the first place. Solaris itself had been bought from Workshop by Rebellion, the 2000 AD guys. It's all the same people, it all joins up, and run by Jason Kingsley, who's I used to know when he was a teenager doing his fanzine Mystic Crystal, which I still have copies of, and we should get scans up of those if you ever interview him, because some of those are hilarious, even worse than Dragon Lords 1. He did the review of the Dredd roleplay game in the pages of White Dwarf, among his first ever paid work, when he was still, I think, just a teenager or just heading into uni. So we've known those guys for a long time. So they picked up Solaris, and I was pitching this new thing that was going to become Angry Robot, just like it. And Solaris's thing back in the day was, we're getting kind of complicated in science fiction publishing. We see people like Orbit and Galance trying to sell books to people who don't read science fiction. And so Solaris was set up as books with spaceships on the front or wizards on the front. Trad, SF and fantasy, but from a modern perspective. But Angry Robot went the other way. It was it could just as easily have been a web comic or a heavy metal band or a brand of skateboard clothing or something. And I say we were going to be called Darkstar, and the HarperCollins lawyer had done some web searches and some legal trademark things, and we were good to go on that. And he sent the note through tea time, and I went to bed thinking, I'm not happy with this. This is not right. And I sat up late into the night just looking for inspiration in death metal T-shirt suppliers, scribbling down adjectives. And when I woke up in the morning, I had 2 columns. And we had 2 columns because there's a character in Warhammer
fantasy called Malice Darkblade, and his name grew out of doing 2 columns of first names and second names. And I did the same thing with this, and the first line said angry and robot. The second line said ninja and monkey. And we all said that ninja monkey would be another line at some point. It could just as easily have been called that. But I said the next morning I said to my liaison at HarperCollins, Chris, the strategy guy I was working with, to liaise with, setting up the business within their team. And he said, that's brilliant. I'm going to go and tell everyone. And he came back an hour later and says, well, I've spoken to all the senior management, and half of them went, bloody hell, that's amazing as a name. And the other half went, what the hell? That's the worst name I've ever heard. So we knew we were onto something. And it became quickly almost a rallying call for trying to do things differently, using a lot of those ideas we'd pioneered at Black Library, talking to your customers as equals. We're all just part of a continuum of gamers and fans and writers who might dabble at NaNoWriMo or go to a writing group or to the BFS or the BSFA and discuss their short fiction, or run a review blog, or just hang out at conventions, right up to the top to being a published, successful, best-selling author, and then on sky's the limit. And that credibility and that being part of the community is what's driven Angry Robot. We've stayed up in Nottingham, even though HarperCollins were down in Hammersmith, because they didn't have any room for us, and they're busy doing their own thing. And it lasted for about a year and a half. But the person who was championing us there moved on to take over another publisher, and we were let go fairly soon afterwards. But as I mentioned earlier, I'd also been discussing potentially building a fiction line with Osprey. So I was on the phone to them 10 minutes later, and I caught them coming back from an award ceremony where they'd won Best Independent Publisher of the year. And after 14 minutes after I'd been told by HarperCollins we were shutting, we were back in business. We bought all the contracts off HarperCollins for £1. And basically HarperCollins paid for Angry Robot to set up. So we stayed up in Nottingham, and we are assisted greatly by having a sales team in the States who are Penguin Random House's sales team. So we go out through the big boys, just like an indie record label, really. So we can be fast and nimble. We follow all our strategies of community building. We talk to our fans. We have a very big Twitter following, bigger than most comparable, even the major publishers in the SF field, and strong at conventions, strong on access to being published. We're running an open door campaign at the moment for another month where unagented authors can send in their manuscripts in the hope of being reviewed. We publish worldwide on the same day. So if you're a fan and you've heard of our book, you can get it wherever you are. We do audiobook as standard, ebook as standard, all the things that have changed. We were right on the edge of doing it, among the first people to do it. The danger is, of course, that entropy sets in and you have to keep reinventing yourself. And there's a whole bunch of strategic things happening behind the scenes. But basically, my day job is I've got a lovely little office with a couple of staffers in the middle of town in Nottingham. And we plot the robot takeover of the world from there. And on we go. 3 books a month, 30 books a year, approximately. And that's been happening for 8 years now. And we've won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and the World Fantasy Award, and the British Fantasy Award, and the Philip K. Dick Award, and the Prometheus Award, and Nebulas and Hugos, and blah, 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 blah. So something's going okay.
And to think it started with that little A4 folded stapled fanzine.
I think it's the same thing, it's seeing what other people can do and saying, I could do that, but I think I've got some ideas to make that even better. And I've realised a bunch of things. I had a little chat with myself about 5 years ago where I found myself thinking, for some unknown reason, perhaps I had sobered up, that I must work out what I'm going to do with my life. And I realised I'd been in publishing in one form or another for 30 years. But one day I'll grow up and get a proper job. But it's that being a producer, being a publisher, being a behind-the-scenes film director type, rather than the star talent, though I've written plenty of things. But I've been a much better editor and compiler and producer and director than I ever was certainly as a novelist. There's a wonderful scene in the middle of the fighting fantasy novel I wrote, Demon Stealer, which the heroes are chasing some bad guys through the desert, and they're bemoaning their fate for page after page. Will this never end? They keep saying as they slog another word, another foot in front of another. And of course, my editor made me take it all out because that's just you. That is. I don't think you'll be doing another one of these. And I realised that I am the producer, string puller, and in some cases, putting people together to make great things happen. In other cases, getting an idea and giving it to other people to do a better job with it than I could ever do.
Well,
But it's where it's always been since those early. I think basic role play, basic D&D taught me that: create the games for other people to enjoy, and sit back and smile smugly when they all die horribly.
Well, you've got an amazing track record of doing that, Mark,
Oh.
and thanks for sharing that with us. It's been fantastic speaking to you. Thank you.
Oh, very welcome. Thank you, and thanks for listening.
Just BLYTHY Rules. Welcome to Derek Malcolm Block, wherein can be found the room of role-playing rambling, home of the Justice Department's favourite rules lawyer, old bony face himself, Judge BLYTHY. Hello, BLYTHY.
Hello, Dirk.
So, we're fresh, aren't we, from playing this game?
Yes, we are.
In Birmingham, the UK's second city after Manchester, and we always say, don't we? We always say that we play the game before we talk about it, because
it's useful. It's useful to do that, isn't it?
Yeah.
It gives the impression that we know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
It helps us give that impression.
So after 35 years, what was it like playing Judge Dredd for the first time?
It was okay.
It was okay.
The games master was a bit rubbish.
Oh, thank you.
Well, perhaps you asked for that. You walked into it, didn't you? You always do. No, I enjoyed it. It is a great setting for a role-playing game, Mega City 1. Whether that's just nostalgia or not is possibly debatable. I don't know.
Well, I think Mega City 1 is a great setting, and I had tremendous fun. We played Better Living Through Chemistry, which is the scenario which was written by Daily Dwarf for the zine.
Yeah, and it's a very good scenario because it pushes all the right buttons, doesn't it? And we won't talk too much about it in case people want to play it, but it does all the right things in all the right places, so to speak.
And it's got layers and layers of jokes and popular culture references.
Yeah.
And it works really, really
just
well.
like the comics do. Like the comic strip did. Yeah. So, it's very, very good.
And it's set in that period just after the Apocalypse War and Blockmania. So it had a real sense of the 80s.
Yes.
So I should perhaps explain that I ran the game twice as a games master, first in the morning and in the afternoon session. It has to be said there was more mature players.
Yes.
Mature players who were aware of Judge Dredd and the setting a lot more than the early game. Because the morning game, that's when I realised that Mega City 1 is really about nostalgia for us in a lot of ways. Because there was a couple of 14-year-olds on the table and it has no currency. Judge Dredd, unfortunately, has no currency for 14-year-olds now, unlike us when we were 14.
Yeah, and that's the thing that's a bit tricky when you're assessing the setting. The degree to which my enjoyment and love of that setting when we were playing comes from nostalgia.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not pure nostalgia because it is a good setting. I mean, it is very clever.
Yeah.
Very evocative and very colourful, and the whole language of Mega City 1, Stooky Glanders, stuff like that. Frank Cannon Block. The language of it is entertaining just in itself, isn't it? The way that things are described.
I was quite taken aback, actually, of the number of people who were playing the game who were unaware of it. And
I was a little bit, I was surprised.
For some people, the only reference they have is either the Stallone movie or the Carl Urban movie.
Yeah.
And the thing with the Carl Urban movie is I quite like it.
Oh, it's a good film, but it's not quite like, it's not really like the comics, is it? It's not quite Judge Dredd in a way.
No. Well, and I felt that in the morning when somebody tried to do an arrest and started effing and jeffing. And he was hauled up by one of the more mature players by saying, no, we said rocking in Mega City 1.
Yeah. Well, I think the Carl Urban film, you enjoy it because you're glad you're not watching the Sylvester Stallone film. You're just glad you're not watching that.
I think that's a debate for another day. I think it has its merits. It
does, but I thought it's a bit of a tough watch.
The art design's good in it, but
yeah. Well, it's everything else. The scenery's good. It's just the moving actors that are no good.
So yeah, I think that's what struck me about Mega City 1 as a. I think it is tinged with nostalgia.
Yes, absolutely.
I think we'll come on to how the mechanics played into that when we talk a bit more about the rules. But yeah, it's great. There was a sharp intake of breath when the fatties rolled in, because it was felt like it was some kind of offensive some way.
Well, but yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it? I enjoyed it when the fatties rolled out, because as a Judge Dredd fan and someone who read the comic when I was a kid, that's part of it, isn't it? So you're not offended; you just see it as that's part of Mega City 1. Because that's the thing with Mega City 1, isn't it? There is a grotesqueness to it. It's part of that British tradition of the grotesque, isn't it? That a lot of the characters in it, apart from the judges, and even some of the judges, are grotesque figures, aren't they? The fatties are a very good example of that.
Yeah. I think the good thing about Mega City 1 as well, it plays into the balance that I like, which is a level of grit, but also a sense of humour about it.
Yeah.
And it works well at the table. I think it translates well at the table.
Yeah. But I think it's this isn't quite the setting, but it's part of the setting. I think the real strength, and it worked well as a convention game, the real strength of the game is the fact that you play judges and you know what you're doing, you know what you're about. So often in role-playing games there is that problem of character motivation, isn't there? Why are we doing this? One of Eddie's favourite lines in any game: why are we doing this? Why are we putting our lives at risk? And sometimes there is that question of, well, are we just going along with it? Why are we investigating the death of our friend by supernatural forces? Because it's Call of Cthulhu and that's what you do. That kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think in Judge Dredd, it's really good that it's so well defined, isn't it? It's absolutely well defined. You're a judge, and what you've got to do is uphold the law, and there are villains and perps and what have you, and you go out and arrest them.
Yeah.
And from that point of view, it's fantastic, because it just gives you a clear focus.
It does give you a clear focus, and the mechanics support you in making sure that you're applying the rule of law.
Yes.
So the perps are allowed to wildfire, so they get advantage on any initiative situation, because they're more likely going to shoot first, because they can just shoot from the hip, whereas judges have to aim and attempt to make an arrest.
Yeah.
So of course it puts people in a position where they're having to make a judgment of whether this constitutes self-defence or...
Yes.
Yeah. So you put laws there, it gives people a moral conflict already, isn't it? So you put people in situations as a games master where they're having to make a decision whether they do the right thing or protect themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And from a role-playing perspective, that's interesting, both from a games master's end and a player's end, in that you are constrained and have to act in a certain way, or at least find your way through that. And again, with role-playing games, it's that thing of not just what motivates a character, but what makes them behave in a consistent way, which can sometimes be a problem, can't it? So in Judge Dredd, you have got that pressure to behave in a consistent way, and there are consequences if you don't, which again is a good thing, I think. It's a neat setting from that perspective.
As a player, is there enough though to differentiate the character? Judges lack a certain personality, don't they? There are a few exceptions in the comics, but on the whole, they lack personality. So, how's that to deal with as a player?
Well, I mean, we'll talk about the mechanics in a bit, but it's a relatively simple system. But I suppose it begs the question: is it too simple?
Yes. Is
it too simple and a bit too... The characters are just... there are some special abilities you can have, but are the characters just numbers?
Yeah.
I have to say as well, whilst I've just said it's fantastic from the point of view that it gives you motivation, and it gives you that moral compass, and it gives you a sense of how you should or shouldn't be acting. And all those things are really positive things in a role-playing game. So you can kind of hit the ground running, and it works well at a convention, and it would work well as a one-shot or over a couple of sessions. I think it would get a bit thin if you played it long-term. I'm not sure how much mileage there is.
There are opportunities to develop as a judge, so you can develop your skills as a judge. You can have specialism, so you can move into different branches. You can become a side judge or a tech judge and choose your special and get increased special abilities. So there is some sort of character development, but I do think what's lacking is any sense of what's your what differentiates you as an individual.
Well, there is, and it's not so much character development. I don't quite mean that. I think, could you play it every other week for a year without getting a bit bored of arresting perps? Is it a bit limiting in terms?
Well, I think some of the best products that were developed for Judge Dredd, so the Slaughter Margin and Judgment Day are big campaigns. They're quite meaty campaigns, but they're very plot driven and very incident driven, and very a deep delve into the world of Mega City 1. Not really about you as a character developing. It's you progressing and travelling through the story, and that's very much from that sample block of that time I had with you on Saturday with those players. Is I felt that part of this was taking people on a tour of Mega City 1. And the adventure encourages that.
Absolutely. That's what's fun about it.
Right, to help this discussion, rather than asking you to choose some highlights, what I thought was that we'd have a look at a character sheet and talk through that and some of the things on there. So what's the first thing that strikes you about that character sheet? What's the first thing you want to look at?
It's dominated a little bit by combat, isn't it? So you've got the there's more space on the character sheet given over to your gun and the cartridges and the the ammunition and equipment than there is to the actual stats.
Yes.
That's one. I mean, that's
It's an interesting observation, that, because the way that the rules were originally presented were that the player's book really just guided you through the resources that you had available to you and told you what kit you had, so your birdie lie detector, your lawgiver, and what the different ammunition was capable of. And as you say, the character sheet's taking over about half the space on there. It's about managing resources.
It's about equipment, And I think when we played it, that came across, didn't it? Because I think afterwards, I think my character sort of fell off a moped, didn't he? He won't give no spoilers, but you said afterwards, you could have gotten your lawmaster to come remotely, and you think, of course I could, So it's based around equipment, isn't it? They're not magic items and not abilities, but you've got stuff. You've got stuff that does stuff. And part of the game really is irrespective of abilities and stats. It's about using the stuff you've got
in effective ways.
And it was really interesting because it was Gaz from the Smart Party, wasn't it, who played the tech character. And like in a lot of science fiction games, you realise the tech guy, in a way, is the most interesting character. Not the most interesting, but can do the most.
Yes.
Because they can hack things and look at, break the locks and do this and do that and circumvent the CCTV camera. They do all sorts of things, tech guys, can't they?
Yeah.
And it's a very modern thing as well, because probably when the game was invented, things like hacking wouldn't have been particularly, it wouldn't be common currency, would they? But nowadays, there's a kind of disproportionate amount of power given to the tech guy, because people say, well, I'm the tech guy, can I just hack into the system and make all the doors open? And the games master, you go, I suppose you can, really.
It's quite interesting, because the Mega City 1, of course, has the Mac computer that controls everything. So it is possible just to think, and the investigation, you can circumvent a lot of investigation by just patching it through to control.
Patching it through, and that's what the tech guy does, so that's kind of interesting. But I suppose that, again, connects to, it's not quite the same, but it connects to that idea of having equipment and resources and stuff that you can use, which quite a big part of the game, really.
And what it encourages you to do is to choose your ammo before each mission, so what kits you're going to have available to you, and mark it off. So as a 14-year-old boy, that's a good thing to do, isn't it? Crossing off every bullet.
That's a lot of fun, isn't it? Picking all your bullets and your stuff, yes.
It was a highlight of Saturday when I saw a group of 40-something gentlemen all holding their fingers in the air as though they're holding guns, pointing them at me. People were miming holding a lawgiver.
Yeah, that's what people do with role-playing games, isn't it?
The point when people were pointing guns at me, I thought they're immersed in this, they're in the scene.
Yeah. It's a good sign.
But you're right, it is very combat oriented. So we should say that the way that hit locations work, now the combat sequence is quite long, isn't it? So you roll to hit.
Yeah.
If you hit, then you roll on location, which is a percentile dice. Then your armour is expressed as a percentage.
Yeah.
And so you roll under your armour, and that depletes if it gets hit, if that absorbs it. If it gets through, you then roll on a damage table.
Yeah.
Your gun will do a damage like D6. You look at the result. You look along. It could be a stun or a wound. If it's a stun, it puts you out of action for the next action. If it's a wound, it knocks amount off your strength. But you also have to roll for a dice to see what goes off your initiative.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of steps.
You sold it to us there, haven't you?
Precisely. It's very
action-packed.
Action-packed. But it does feel if in the 80s this was a tabletop game with miniatures, you can see how that. Because that's how I see it. I saw this demonstrated at a convention with polystyrene blocks and back in the 80s, and loads of little miniature figures and a perp shootout.
Yeah.
But that's not a role-playing game, is it?
No, and I suppose that's what I mean about it could get a little bit thin. It gives you all those kind of safety nets and rolls to make before you hit.
Yeah.
And even when you hit, there's still a chance that it's not all that bad.
Yeah.
And it's getting around that problem, isn't it?
But it can be fairly devastating, though, because...
It can be, yeah.
Unlike the rest of your attributes, your strength is expressed between 1 and 4.
Yeah.
So in this character's got 2 strength. It's entirely possible with a single blow to be down to 0, unconscious or dead.
Yeah.
The other thing that depletes is your initiative, and your initiative is a key stat because it'll determine how many actions you have in a round, so that's expressed as a percentage. So every 10 and you round up, that's how many actions you have in a round. And as that gets reduced, so does the number of actions you can take in the round. Which, in theory, when I read that, I thought, well, that makes sense. That's good. But in play, it's hard to administer that, isn't it?
Yeah. You're also not that great at things.
Yeah. Well, we'll come on to that. Hold that thought.
But that's part of it as well. So it's not that easy to hit. When you do hit, you get armour rolls, you get all these kind of rolls.
See, part of the thing I did on Saturday in play was to adjust things to keep things moving along. It's actually hard to get rid of perps, because perps deplete at a similar rate, but they don't have necessarily armour. But I had a rule that if you rolled a stun, then they were knocked out completely, and if you rolled a wound, that without, so like mook rules, just to get them out of the way. I know that Daily Dwarf, when he ran it, he had an escalation die, so your actual chance to hit improved as the combat progressed. Yeah, because you're right, it is hard to do things, and I think we need to say that, don't we? Because I could see you looking forlorn by the...
I have to say, I put it on the record, I had some terrible rolls. I mean, I think I just had some absolutely, God, I had bum rolls. I think I changed my dice at one point.
You did, yeah.
Really superstitious way of a rational human being, but I changed my dice because I still rolled terribly. So there was that to it. I just had dreadful rolls. But that said, it's a percentile system, and for example, this character's got driving skill 28%. Now, we know that doesn't mean you have to roll that when you get on something and try and drive that. We know that, but in a chase, you'd like to think a judge might be a bit better than that.
Yeah.
That's one of the slight glitches in it. You think,
well, I don't think it's more than it. I think it's more than a slight glitch, because I found as a games master, by the end of the day, when the nostalgia was wearing off a bit, and I was trying to do things,
we were incapable of doing
you were incapable of doing it.
You keep missing the role, yeah.
Because you reach that point, don't you, where you want to replicate the action of the comic.
Yes.
And I think at times I was encouraging people, even though there was counters on the table and floor plans, I was saying, ignore physics, this is a comic strip. People were doing that, but still failing. And
I think, that's one of the problems is, I mean, we talk about the stats in a minute, but it's stat-based. There are special abilities, but a lot of those special abilities just add to your percentage chances. It might give 10% chances or ability to do something. But
your attributes are expressed as a percentage, aren't they? So most things are resolved by rolling over the relevant attribute.
I mean, the stats are a bit odd as well, and they do. It's interesting, isn't it? They do echo a tabletop battle game rather than a role-playing game, I think. When you look at them, let's look at some. So strength, right? Strength 2. All that seems to mean to me is that you can take 2 wounds. Doesn't seem to mean anything more than that.
You can test strength, but you do it on a D4.
Yeah.
Whereas everything else is on a.
Yeah. Then you've got initiative, which is a sort of indicator of. Did we use it as agility as well?
Yeah, it's agility, so it's your...
So again, it's a sort, but the way they describe it is initiative rather than agility or dexterity. It's very, very...
So I thought that was...
gamey.
I thought that was all right.
But then you've got... What I mean is, though, you've got combat skill, and then you've got street skills, tech skills, drive skills, medical skills, and if you've got them, psi skills. The language of those stats...
Yeah.
It feels like it's a tabletop war game rather than a role-playing game. It is a role-playing game, and the stats work. You can do stuff with them. It's not a massive problem.
Part of the difficulty is its oversimplification. Yeah. So things expressed as a percentage on the attributes is one thing. You also have special abilities which will give your character an edge in some certain situations, such as being agile or dodging a shot.
Yeah.
But really, I felt like all judges should have those special abilities, or those aspects to their character, because you're a judge, you're not doing a Lawmaster kick. Every judge should have the opportunity.
I agree, and that's kind of what I meant about the drive skill being so low. They would be good at it. They just would be. You wouldn't take the game mechanics and say, oh, well, I'll tell you what, let's make all the judges 80% and everything. It just begs the question as whether there's a better mechanic. A better mechanic to deal with those kind of things.
Because not only does it mean that you're failing often using the percentage system in this way, it doesn't give you any facility to do really, really well as well. So there's no critical within it. So you don't. Players can't get that pleasure of rolling a good roll.
Yeah, I certainly didn't when we played. The displeasure of rolling bad ones.
And it feels in that comic book environment that you need to be able to.
Yeah.
I let people shoot through walls and that kind of thing, but
you're right. They don't have superpowers, but they have super equipment and they're super trained, aren't they? Like a bit like Batman.
Yeah.
So on that basis, it is in that ballpark of a superhero game, isn't it? You're a judge in Mega City 1. You're a tough guy. You're not. It doesn't work like, say, a fantasy game might work, where you start off as a farm boy with a rusty sword and build your way up. You're a judge, So unless you're all rookies, which I suppose you can be, and that might be a bit plausible, but you're playing in the game we played. There was a rookie, but the rest, some of us were grizzled old judges, weren't we? And you'd think these guys have been around the block, literally, a few times. they'd be good at stuff.
Yeah.
But you're right. The mechanics, the system doesn't lend it couldn't allow you to have brilliant percentages and everything, because then it would be boring, because you would achieve everything.
Yeah.
The mechanics don't quite. So I mean, it does feel like a skirmish game.
So it's ripe, I think, this. So if you took the Games Master's book that came with this book, which is great because it tells... I know that Daily Dwarf last time said that he struggled with it because it doesn't tell you how to write adventures, but I think even back in the day when I read it, adventures sprung off the page because there were just so many great things, great crimes.
There's a lot of material there.
Great characters, great perps, great citizens, great situations, great design. I like the way that scenarios start with a patrol sheet. You know what's out there. Be careful out there. The Hill Street Blues type thing. I love that.
Very kind of structured, isn't it? Which is quite good. Yeah.
And you can give hints and tips, and you can you can prepare a scenario that has little in jokes and lots of good stuff. So if you're gonna do it, how would you do it? Putting the mechanics aside.
I mean, what system you would pick to run it? Or
how would you approach it?
Something like Fate would lend itself to it, where you've got sort of traits and feats and things that you can bring, and also you've got that flexibility to suggest things in a comic book kind of way. Like Feng Shui does that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know, it's comic.
I think Feng Shui would be good because that's action orientated, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think what was interesting when we played it was it has this feel of being a tabletop skirmish game, and you had all the counters and everything, which added a lot. I think it added a lot because it gave it kind of real visual thing, particularly for people who are not familiar with 2000 AD. That was all good, but there was a point, and a couple of points where you said. At the end, you said, it's a comic book. It's a comic book. Forget where you're talking. It's a comic book. Like you say, people shooting around corners. People said, what? Hang on a minute. I'm positioned here. And you went, it's a comic book. Forget all that. Ignore that. You're ignoring all those things.
So the IP now, the intellectual property, is now owned by Wine. I pronounced it wrongly last time. What's old is new. So if we were going to give them some advice in going forward and doing this, that's what we want to see, isn't it? Some more fluidity.
Fluidity. Something where players can negotiate action. Yeah. So something like Night's Black Agents, where you've got that ability to every game. There's one thing you can definitely do, and you decide when that moment is.
Yeah,
but that sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
doesn't make you too powerful, but it gives you that ability to influence the narrative a bit, and say, my judge is going to do this. This is his moment in the spotlight. This is the moment where he's going to get on his lawmaster and give chase, and keep up with this guy. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't allow you to do it all the time, but it does allow you to do that rather than. Like my character, rolling to do things and just failing every time. I can't do anything. Oh crap! How have I survived so long as a judge?
I think it would benefit for either the fluidity of something like Feng Shui and Fate, and I think Gaz was saying something like Savage Worlds might work.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you could say that, but I also think, a few episodes ago we looked at James Bond RPG.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to go down the route of old school, building up a character with skills and different abilities, but also having the ability to be really good at something. James Bond could be a route, couldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, and in its defence, it's a game from the 80s, and I suppose some of those...
All the games that we talk about.
Well, but, we always do this, and in its defence, before it's sent to an ISO cube, before its defence.
And I think this is the first game of the series of podcasts that I've gone back that I have. On Saturday, when we went back to Mega City 1, when we were playing in Mega City 1, it was like recapturing that moment in 2010 when we first stepped back into Glorantha. It was like coming home. And there was something great about that moment of being in Mega City 1. However, this is the first game of the series where I feel like the mechanics
belong back in the 80s.
Yes, yeah.
I want to play Judge Dredd with this box set, with some of the supplements that were produced in the 80s, but I wouldn't want to run it with these mechanics. I'd recommend you read Better Living Through Chemistry.
Oh yeah, a fantastic scenario.
Good scenario, and it was written to be read as well as played, and it's just so many great moments in it, so I tell people to go back. Now, last time we did this, BLYTHY, we were rubbish at it, so I'm going to have another go before we finish at seeing if you can, off the top of your head, riff a story based on 2 elements. So when we were playing, one of the players actually said, the thing that differentiated 2000 AD in the 80s is that it would take something from popular culture, so a popular format, and something that was in the news, and bring them together, right? Yeah. Now, we tried it last time. You came up with a rubbish one.
I think you might find that's true this time as well.
I came up with a really good one, but let's see.
Well, okay. Yeah, I see.
Okay.
I say this is going.
I'm going to pull out of the helmet, the judge's helmet.
Yeah.
2 things. Now, these are genuinely random.
Genuinely random. Okay, go on.
And it's Brexit.
Oh my God.
So that's the UK leaving the European Union.
Did you think of that? Has that been in the news recently?
And the other thing is the Game of Thrones.
Jacob Rees-Lannister. I don't... Game of Thrones and Brexit. They're the same thing, aren't they? They're not different. You've picked the same things out of the helmet. You've picked the same things, just different names.
I bet Ken and Robin are bricking it.
There isn't another bit.
Thank you very much to Marc for giving such a fantastic interview in this episode. The memories of his time at Games Workshop are fresh in his mind as he's been discussing the old days with his former boss, Jamie Thompson, who's working on a definitive history of Games Workshop between 1975 and 1985. The plans are for a full-colour illustrated hardback. It's on the crowdfunding platform Unbound, with very attractive pledge awards, including a facsimile copies of The Owl and Weasel, the newsletter which was the precursor to White Dwarf, produced by Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson when they started their company. I'll put a link in the show notes. I'll be running Judge Dredd at UK Games Expo in the summer. It's booked up, but if you'd like to read the adventure, then the PDF of the Grognard Files fanzine is now available for patrons. If you enjoy Daily Dwarf's writing for the podcast, and who wouldn't, then you'll love Better Living Through Chemistry, the scenario he wrote for the zine. It's funny and inventive. Patreon is the way that we fund the podcast and supporting projects. The podcast will always be free, but the generous support of the Grog Squad keep us going and encourage us to do more activities. We've reached the goal of virtual grog meet, so on the 13th and 14th of April 2018 we'll be running online games. Information will be sent out in March to patrons. Thanks to all of the Grog Squad for their continued support, and thank you and welcome to new patrons. At the $1 level, there's Lee Williams and Soin Pritchard. Thank you. For those who support us at $5 or more a month, we like to award them with a virtual gift from the game under discussion. This time, they're going to receive a special mutation. They'll become a mutie and be cast out to the other side of the huge plastine wall. It's a beautiful wall, the biggest and bestest wall. So, first up, it's Greg Fetzer, and he's got a shrunken knee. Thank you, Greg. Okay, next, Simon Hatch. And Simon's got hands with an unusual skin texture. Thanks, Simon. And David Black, he's got legs where his arms should be, so you can pretend that you're the Isle of Man. So thanks, David. Okay, Ben Galvin, here you go, Ben, especially for you. You've got an elbow fixed at 180 degrees. It's helpful for scratching your backside. Thanks, Ben. And next up is Matt Woodylove. And Matt gets shrunken teeth. Thanks, Matt. And finally, Goodmania. Goodmania has got a chest of an antelope. Thank you very much. Thank you all, mateys. Now, get back to Cursed Earth. Next time, we'll get fitter, happier, more productive, comfortable. The computer is our friend. The alpha complex awaits our paranoia. I don't know about you, but since the last podcast, the universe seems a bit emptier. Adios, amigos.